It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce General Jim Dubik. I highly encourage you to read his bio in the board packet, but in the registration packet, but also to go to our website to see the detailed bio, because nothing I could say could do him justice. He retired after 37 years of exceptional service in the U.S. Army. His last assignment was to help train Iraqi security forces, military and political. He is the consummate leader, a man of profound faith. He was one of our very first trustees when the Roundtable was created. And even when he was deployed in Iraq, he would conference call in to our board meetings and to special gatherings that we would have by teleconference. So deeply did General Dubik believe in the mission of the Leadership Roundtable. I have learned personally about many things from this wonderful leader and friend. He is a trustee and a special advisor to the board and staff, and I give you General Jim Dubik.
Well, thanks, Carrie. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming here to this year's annual conference. As I was thinking about the themes of this conference, adopting structures that will serve us in the 21st century and renewing managerial practices and collaborating, the thing that kept coming back to my mind was land navigation. And I thought, boy, that is really weird. Why am I having these memories of land navigation? But I stuck with it, and I hope by the end of my few minutes that you will come to realize why this stuck in my mind. So there we were, and I have to back up already. You know the difference between a fairy tale and a war story. The fairy tale starts out with once upon a time, and the war story starts off with so there we were. So there we were in Panama. I'd parachuted into Panama as a brand new lieutenant in the early 1970s, 400 other guys. We jumped into a jungle clearing, and we were supposed to link up on the side of the drop zone and then infiltrate from the drop zone in small groups to a place where we were going to practice a raid on some kind of enemy facility. The jump went fine. We had very few injuries. Most of us landed on a drop zone. We all linked up together, and we broke down in other groups and took off. And as a junior officer, I was assigned with two other junior officers as one of the three people on the navigation team for our group. Of course, our group included the battalion commander and several other senior leaders, so we were a little nervous. It's nighttime. Nothing happens really interesting in the Army during the day, so we jumped in at night, and I should say that it was so dark that sometimes literally you had to hold on to the person in front of you. And I don't mean that figuratively. I mean grab the equipment of the person in front of you so you could follow where that person went. Double, triple canopy jungle, completely dark at night to begin with. So we set off. And since this was 1974 or 5, there were no night vision goggles, so you don't see anything. There was no global positioning system, so this was map and compass, and eyeballs open as wide as you can open your eyeballs. And the way you move through the jungle most of the time is you throw your body against the jungle. You back up, take 2 steps forward, throw your body against the jungle. And you do this for many, many, many hours. It's very tiring. And after several hours of doing this, and I mean like 7 or 8, we were supposed to have been at a river. We were not. And not only we were not at a river, we were at a swamp. And it wasn't one of those swamps that those of you who live in parts of the world where you have swamps, some of them precede a river. And you can say, oh, good, this is really the river bank. We must be at the river. No, it wasn't that kind of swamp. So we sat down, and one of the other members of the group said, I'll go forward. So he goes forward into the night, and all you hear is, and then after a few seconds, psst, 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 pull me out. Because you can't talk, you're supposed to be pretending you're sneaking up on the enemy, so you're all whispering all the time, so pull me out. So the two of us crawl out on our stomachs, we grab him, we pull him out. And now we're sitting down, what the heck are we going to do? And our plan was to use this is called the box method. This is an example where theory and practice don't match, but this is the theory. You go 90 degrees this way until you pass the swamp, then you turn and you keep track of the number of steps. Then you turn 90 degrees until you pass the swamp, you keep track of the number of steps. Then you turn 90 degrees, keep track of the number of steps, and theoretically, you're on the other side of the swamp. So we're figuring this out, these three lieutenants, and the battalion commander is unhappy with how long his lieutenants are taking in leading the team. So we can hear him thrashing through the jungle trying to get to us, thrash, 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 thrash. And he sits down, he says, what are you guys doing? Trying to yell, but whispering at the same time. He said, well, sir, we hit a swamp. No kidding, this is the jungle, there's swamps everywhere. Just go forward, follow me. And about 2 seconds later, psst, 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 hey, pull me out. So we go, two of us go back, we pull him out, and he says, let's go around it. Good idea, sir, we're going to go around it. So we did this. We took the 90 degrees, and we counted our steps, throwing ourselves against the jungle for like another 3 hours. And we ended up at 90, 90, 90, and the only thing we were really lost then. The sun came up, we had been walking all night, and we were nowhere near where we were supposed to be. In fact, it took us another day and night to get where we were supposed to be there the first night. Now, we all had maps, and we all had compasses. And while it was a funny story, we were all pretty experienced navigators. But the map, at nighttime in the jungle, the map is nearly useless because you can't see the terrain features and then identify the terrain features to the map to know where you are. So hold that thought. Hold that Panama thought for a while. So there we were. And now it's fast forward 18 years. I'm a colonel, and I'm leading a brigade combat team into Haiti in 1994 to reseat the President Aristide and his government. And my unit was inserted on a partially done airfield by Camp Haitian in northern Haiti, where my headquarters would be, and then we were going to be responsible for reseating the governments in northern Haiti. We had great maps, I'm happy to report. On this one, they showed all the terrain features, where the little villages were, where the roads, the bridges, where the mountains were. In Cap Haitian, the large city, it had roads, it had the prominent buildings, it had all the power structures where all the public works needed to be. And this time we were inserted during the day, so we even knew where we were, and we knew we had no trouble, really getting around. But we still had this huge navigation problem. The maps that we were given didn't show the terrain that we really needed to understand to accomplish our mission. The physical and geographic features didn't matter. They were important, but they were much lesser important. What we needed to know was social, political, cultural, and religious kinds of questions. Who opposed Aristide? Who supported Cedrus? Who was provoking all the violence that we came to stop? Who were the Aristide supporters that we could maybe count on? And those kinds of questions. And you would think that before we went into Haiti, we would have had those answers, but we did not. There was 2 weeks from the time that my brigade combat team was alerted to the time that I was sitting in Cap Haitian wondering all these things. So we were as much in the dark in Haiti, though it was broad daylight, as we were in Panama, just for different sets of reasons. So I want you to hold that thought. So there's a Panama thought, and then there's a Haiti thought. And now fast forward 13 more years to 2007. Here, I'm now a 3-star general sent to Iraq with Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus as one of the senior leaders to execute the change in policy that is commonly known as the surge. I arrived there in May of 2007. about 2.5, 3 months prior to the height of the violence. And the violence was pretty high. And all the headlines in the newspapers in the spring of 2007 were negative. It was inevitable that we were going to lose, that we were going to be thrown out of the country, that we would have an ignominious withdrawal of U.S. forces, the first in a long, long time. The counteroffensive that had begun had shown no signs of progress in the summer of 2007, and we weren't sure of how things were going to turn out at all. And the job of the organization that I was put in charge of was, at this time, to accelerate the growth of the Iraqi army and police forces in not just size, but in capability and in confidence, so that when the coalition's counteroffensive was completed, they would be large enough and good enough and confident enough that they could handle the security in their country to their own standard, and we could leave. So the task was to create and expand these forces and the ministries of defense and interior, because that's part of how you build a self-sustaining force, while the war was going on, before we knew who was going to win, at the height of sectarian violence, and before Maliki really formed a government. You know, there's that old commercial of building an aircraft while in flight. Well, our aircraft was not only being built in flight, it was being shot at while it was being built, and flown and crewed by people who had never done that before. So the issue at hand here was the plan that we had inherited, because, you know, I had a predecessor, was just flat not working. The security forces were not growing. In some parts of the country, they refused to leave their home provinces. In some parts of the country, they refused to fight. In other parts, they were in collusion with the insurgents, whether Sunni or other sectarian militias. And we needed a new plan, and we needed a new plan fast. So yet again in my career, I had a navigation problem. This time, you know, we weren't just in the dark. This time we didn't have the wrong map. This time there was no map at all. I would say, if you have your iPhones on or you've got your iPads going, Google build an army during a war without a formed government, and nothing comes up. So there's no map for this kind of stuff. So hold that thought. Panama thought, Haiti thought, Iraqi thought. What I presented is 3 different kinds of navigation problems. And I would say that, and my bet is that each of you have had similar experiences. I mean, haven't you at one point or another, even right now, felt that you have a map, but you can't see the features that should guide your thinking? That you can't see around you, that you're in the dark, maybe not physically, but you're in the dark conceptually, because you can't figure out where you are. Haven't you at some point or another felt that your map, or the map that your organization is using, is incomplete, or has the wrong terrain features, the wrong prominent terrain features, so that you can't quite seem to make the right decision at the right time? And haven't you felt sometimes that you've been asked to do things in your organization right now that there's no map at all to follow? And I think, given the pace of change, and given the depth and the breadth of change and the complexity of all the environments that we face, regardless of professional sector, any honest answer to those 3 questions is yes, and yes, and yes. You can get lost in more ways than being stuck in the swamp in Panama. So what does a leader do in these kinds of circumstances? That's really the issue. And I'm going to provide at least one answer from my perspective. But before I do that, I want to be clear about one thing as leaders. The led know when you're lost. There's no fooling them. And whether you're like me, a lieutenant, under a poncho at night, because you have to put a poncho up, getting your flashlight out, trying to see where you are, and every private and sergeant around me say, well, we know what's going on. The LT is lost. The same goes on in every one of your organizations. You cannot fool the followers. So none of us are paid to solve what I'll call routine problems that recur so often that you have a standard operating procedure to follow. We're paid, we make our money to solve problems that have no answers, or answers that are so temporary that you have to keep adapting as the circumstances changing. So with that in mind, now, what should leaders do? And my answer is that depends on how you view yourself as a leader. Those who believe that leaders are supposed to have all the answers, those who believe that leaders do all the thinking, and that followers do, well, merely follow, do what they're told. These kinds of leaders in the situations, whether it's a Panama-like, Haiti-like, or Iraqi-like, become much more authoritative and much more centralized. They aggregate more and more decisions to themselves. And under conditions of ambiguity, like the ones I've presented, organizations led by these kinds of leaders generally follow one of four paths. Path number one, the organization could move forward. They accomplish all their objectives because the leaders have figured it out very quickly and issued orders, and the followers execute. We call this in the Army dumb luck. This doesn't happen very often. More likely, the second path an organization like this takes is the organization stands still. It's like me under my poncho and everybody else laying down, wondering, what's the lieutenant doing under there? The organization goes nowhere while the leader tries to figure out where he is, where the organization is, and how to move forward. And if this stagnancy goes on long enough, members lose confidence, not just in the leadership, but they lose commitment to their organization. The third path that leaders who are more centralized and authoritative, their organization may take, is what I'll call spinning their wheels. There's lots of movement. Everybody's busy. Everybody's tired at the end of the day. Lots of activity, but there's no movement forward. The leader's issuing a lot of instructions. Of course, the leader doesn't know where the organization is or where it's going, but he's doing leadership stuff. He's telling people what to do. And everybody's working and busy, but they're not going anywhere at all. Here again, leadership, the organization becomes irrelevant, the leadership becomes irrelevant, and commitment fades away. And then the last, and I've seen every one of these organizations in the Army, last, the organization moves forward in spite of the leaders, where somehow the followers just give lip service to the leaders and take charge. They do what has to be done, but in the process, the organization becomes dysfunctional because there's this huge gap between what the leader is saying and what the organization is doing. And I could tell a cajillion stories where literally Army organizations would get orders from their commanders and do what they knew had to be done. And the leader was so incompetent, he just kind of followed along as a follower. So this kind of organization does exist. And under conditions of ambiguity, the more complex the navigation problem is, the greater the uncertainty, the more likely an organization led by an authoritative centralized leader goes to options 2, 3, and 4. So there's another alternative, though. If you're a kind of leader that says, look, I'm the leader and I am responsible, we are lost, I've got to figure this out, but I can leverage others in figuring it out. This is an entirely different answer to the question what the leaders do. And by others, I mean subordinates, peers, and seniors alike. Then the possibilities become something different. When you're lost like you are in Panama, rather than going under your poncho, you send 3 people out that way, go 400 meters, 90 degrees that way, tell me what you see. Go that way, tell me what you see. Go that way, tell me what you see. Come back, tell me what you saw, and then let's find a place in a map that meets all those four locations. This increases the probability that you'll find out where you are and increases the probability that you're going to move forward in the direction that you want to go. When the map is incomplete, there's a similar set of activities. The leader starts first identifying with others what information he or she needs. And sometimes the best ideas come from those closest to the problem. It's not just your subordinates and your peers and your seniors. You just don't look up to find answers. You look down to find answers. And in this case, again, the result increases the probability that you'll identify the right information requirements and increases the probability that you'll find the right answers to those information requirements, figure out where your organization is, and move forward. And if the leader has no map at all, my Iraq situation, then the leader of the second category taps into the corporate brain of the whole organization, of members, of subordinates, of peers, of seniors, of coalition partners, of Iraqis, so that you can find out some kind of map where you build a map that is good enough, and then use that same set of people to adapt as you move forward, reinforcing things that are going right, that are working, and identifying very quickly stuff that is not working, and changing it around. So leadership becomes a more corporate kind of affair in those kinds of situations. So in sum, from my view, the leaders of the first category fear admitting that they're lost. Leaders in the second category already know their followers know they're lost. Leaders of the first category insulate themselves, where leaders of the second category collaborate. Leaders of the first category think that leadership is a zero-sum game. Leaders of the second category know that leadership shared is leadership increased. And when in conditions of uncertainty, ambiguity, like we all face, leaders of the first category decrease the probability of success. Leaders of the second category increase the probability of success. And this is the theme of this year's annual conference. Each of the other speakers will be much more detailed in their talks about collaboration and adaptation, but the message is, I think, is going to be pretty clear. In today's kind of fast-paced, changing world, successful leaders collaborate more than their predecessors, and they adapt their organizations more often than their predecessors. And organizations without those kinds of leaders are at risk. Darwin is not just a theory about biological evolution. It has organizational implications. Organizations die if they can't adapt. And we all get lost to one degree or another. That's not the issue. The issue is, what do you do when you're lost? So thanks for your attention. Thanks for coming here today and for at least laughing at a couple of my jokes. I look forward to any of your questions now and for the rest of the time. So as they say in the rifle range, the target's up. It's date times, a stationary target, 25 meters. Should be pretty easy to hit.
Jim, thank you very, very much for your wonderful remarks, and gave us a lot to think about, and very apropos to what we're talking about today. In terms of collaboration, you face some incredible challenges with, for example, in Iraq, trying to deal with sort of ad hoc agencies, coalitions, and so forth. What are some of the key challenges that you took away, and how you or maybe the most important challenge you took away from trying to collaborate with sort of an amorphous group, and what are the things you have to do to really make that work?
Thanks. Well, first, you have to recognize that you have to collaborate. Don't get under the poncho. Second, you have to respect that other people may have answers that you have never thought of. And you got, for me, you have to throw rank away. Good ideas don't have rank. They're good ideas because they're good ideas, not because they came from someone. Third, it's an issue of time management, because there are so many people with whom to collaborate. The rhythm of meetings that you set up and the way you manage your time will either allow you to collaborate or be an obstacle to collaboration. So off the top of my head, I would lay those three out. But the first two, perhaps the most important, is right up here. Your own blocking, thinking that you're a leader. If you think you're a leader of type 1, you're not going to, you just can't do it. You've got to remind yourself that you're a leader type 2. So, thank you.
Paul Henderson from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, Director of Planning. Thank you very much, General, for the reflection. It really struck me in a number of ways, and in two of the ways, it brought back some thoughts about the challenge that was laid before us the previous session. And maybe if you could just comment on two things. Is that one of the things that I heard when you were talking about, even with the map, there's still that facet of making a decision, that you have to make a decision. So whether you have a map or not, a lot of times there's options. And one of the things that I'm finding is that we're not always good at decision making, or we try to make decisions that take us through an easier course, when on long term a more strategic approach might take us more on a longer course, might be more difficult, but it's the right course. And then the other point, which I think is a real challenge for us today in the church, is that there's a lot of talk within the church about collaboration, but there's also that sense we choose to identify who we're going to collaborate with, and we don't always seem to get the broadest opinions. And so when we're looking to set out our path, how do we make sure that we are making the right decisions so that there's good decision making, but also that our people we're choosing to collaborate with represent a broad spectrum, and it just doesn't end up almost in groupthink.
Yeah, well, let me tackle the second one first, because at least from my experience in the Army, many of our leaders understand collaboration as, I take my answer to a meeting and convince everyone else it's right. That's not collaboration. And from the reaction, I take it that you're familiar with the phenomena. Another misunderstanding of collaboration is, I'm going to get the people who agree with me in a meeting, and then we're going to talk about my right answer. Again, that's not collaboration. If you're not humble enough to understand that you don't know the answer, and you start from that base, you're not going to collaborate. You're going to be in one of these other false modes of collaboration. So the first is to be intellectually honest with yourself and humble enough to say, look, I don't know this. I can't tell you how many times in Iraq I've said, I had 13 subordinate generals, look, you think I know the answer? Why did I call this meeting? We have to figure out the best answer that we can possibly figure out. Then if it works, fine. If it doesn't, we'll adapt it. You have to start from, I think, in collaboration with that, and respect the fact that others' experience is equally valid as yours. On the decision making, for us, we're drilled in a decision making methodology from the time that you put on a uniform. There's a simple one that's called troop leading procedures, and we lay it out, and you just follow the steps, and the steps are always include alternative courses of action and analysis of alternative courses of action. Where we have problems, and again, I can't, never worked in your shoes, but where we have problems is you limit the course of action. The course of actions are limited by the imagination of your staff. If you have a staff with limited imagination, you're not going to get broad alternative courses of action. And this is where the leader's responsibility is to seek out the alternatives his or her staff will not give him or her. So you go talk to your subordinates. While the staff is squirreling away doing staff things, you go talk to your subordinates. You go talk to your subordinates' subordinates. You go talk to your peers. You might even have a discussion with your seniors about a similar problem. And you come back to the staff, and when they say, sir, we have 3 courses of action to consider, 1, 2, and 3, which should we develop? No, I want you to look at 3, 4, and 5. Go back to the starting board. If you don't have a commander who's willing to put himself or herself out of the staff mode, then you're always going to be limited to limited courses of action. So.
And so there we were.
At least you didn't start once upon a time.
My name is Tom Sweetser. I work with parishes around the country as a resource, what we call now parish assessment and renewal. And I find that the pastors are the key issue always, and they are stretched too thin. They are saying too many masses. They have 2 or 3 parishes. And they want the worst way to be collaborative, and they haven't got a prayer. They can't do it. Their staffs are overworked, but they're not working to the most effective level. They're doing all the other stuff. The only thing that I've found that's helpful, and I found this out just recently, you cannot expect that pastor to do this. And the pastor says, well, I'm here to be in charge, I guess. I don't know. And the beauty of that is that he then has it within his ability to say, I'm not in charge. Because he's in charge, he can say, I think we need to do this some other way. Well, but he doesn't have the time to do that. So what I've discovered is you need to find somebody else. And it's usually somebody in the parish that's maybe retired or has some time, maybe 15 hours a week, that has the abilities from their work as human resources and so forth to be a partner with that pastor. Mm-hmm. And we always say, wait till we get there. We spend 2.5 weeks with the parish. Wait till we get there, because the pastor tends to find somebody that's like himself. Bad. But wait. And then we ask the staff and others, who would be this right person? We ask the pastor. And there's always somebody somewhere. And we say, it's just 6 months. Just give it 6 months. That can be a person that can sit down with a pastor and say, let's try to work this out, and then work with the staff, and then work with the council. But somebody that doesn't have all the baggage and doesn't have any more authority than the pastor says, that's my partner, that can make a difference. And a lot of times that person says, I got to stay on here more than 6 months or find somebody else. But it's impossible to expect the pastor to be this kind of person in charge in the situation we're in right now. They just can't do it.
Well, I guess I partially agree and partially disagree. I cannot disagree with your experience, and so I won't do that. But the part I agree with is this is not a one-person job. Leadership is a team sport. And I go back to leader model number 1. Whether you call them an authoritative, or call the leader an authoritative and a centralized leader, or have some other words, our American models of leadership bend toward this individualist guy with the white hat or the black hat and the white horse or the sword or whatever heck you've got. An individual comes forward on the horse and saves the day. Well, okay, we have one model of that, but even he had 12 helpers. The rest of us are in team sports. And so that part I would agree with you. This is not a one-person job. This is a team and a team effort. But if the part I disagree with is I have found, at least in my experience, that many people who are overwhelmed often because they confuse the urgent with the important, and they get captured by what's happening in front of their face at this very minute, and can't manage their time to focus their time on what's important and to put a rhythm into their lives so that the rhythm helps the organization know when and where that organization is going to see the leader. So that's a whole nother discussion, but again, I can only partially agree and partially disagree. So, yeah.
Jim, Kevin Kennedy again. From your experience, I'm going to ask you if you have any language or method that can help us in the church clearly distinguish between what really is strategic decision-making versus tactical. Now, to make that concrete, I've been asked on a number, because my background and my strength is in strategic planning. So on a number of occasions, I've been asked to join a diocesan committee or some sort of church organization to help in a strategic planning effort. And I realize what I'm involved in is we need technical, tactical solutions to a problem we've isolated and identified. And was the person who asked me to get involved disingenuous or lying to me? No, what I come to realize is they just don't have the language or the method to make that distinction. Yeah. And can you help us out?
Well, I don't know if I can provide an answer, Kevin, but first on the strategic side, I would say if you're dealing with a problem that has an answer, it's not strategic. If you're dealing with a problem that you will see in your tenure as the leader, it come to fruition, is probably not strategic either. If you're dealing with a problem that is so complex, you really can't understand the nature of the problem. And the solution is going to be so complex that it will take multiple years and multiple leaders to execute it. Then you're working on a strategic problem. Now, the other part, though, is tactics and strategy should be related. So if you're dealing with a strategic problem, you should be able to break down that execution or movement toward that problem in short bursts, 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, 9 month bursts. So you'll have a tactical aspect of your execution. But if it's a true strategic problem, you'll need at least every 9 months a review of the actions you're taking, because you're not going to be sure whether they're going to work or not work. So I guess that's another mark. If you can identify the solution and you don't need any reviews because you're going to be able to see it play out, then it's not a strategic problem either. I don't know if that helps, but like most of your questions, I have to go back and think about it. You know, off-the-cuff answers don't really work.
General John Hurley, Baltimore. Question I had that seemed to be a critical issue that you dealt with was the paradigm shift of the surge and that sort of thing, what was working as opposed to going in with a different, recognizing, number one, it wasn't working and then doing something else. Within the church, I think often, I'll speak from the American experience anyway, that most of our management tends to come from parish management comes from the fact that many recognize we have a vocation crisis, which I think is the wrong place to start. I'm a firm believer that we don't have a vocation crisis in the church. I think we have a resistance of being open to the Spirit, about where the Spirit's calling us. We look at most of our dioceses, certainly on the East Coast. We built these huge churches in our cities when people didn't have cars and they had to walk to churches. Now we have all these buildings that we are emotionally attached to when everybody moved to the burbs. I'm just wondering, how do we make that, what, from your experience, can we move beyond that, to make that paradigm shift in ourselves? I mean, we're talking about managing for mission. And it seems like in many of our dioceses, right-sizing is always driven by money and a lack of clergy. When I think there are other creative ways of looking at that and lifting up the call to baptism that all of us share, and that I think you were talking about subordinates and all of that sort of situation. But in learning from that surge paradigm shift, what elements of that can help us in the church in the United States move to managing for mission rather than managing for vocation crisis?
Well, I'll leave that to you, Father, about whether it's a vocation crisis or openness to the Spirit. But from my own professional experience in the surge that you asked about, it took near national disaster for the national leaders to realize, hey, it's not working. When the former President Bush administration in 2006 realized they had bet on the wrong direction and they were losing, and it took that level of near disaster for them to be open to an alternative solution. So sometimes, as the Chinese would say, opportunity exists in crisis, but only if you recognize it. The Bush administration could just as easily have come to a different conclusion, as many tried to argue them out of the change in strategy and surge, in uniform and not in uniform. So the first is identifying that you are in a crisis, taking ownership for the crisis, and then making yourself open to alternative ways. That sounds simple, doesn't it? But look how bad things were in Iraq in 2006 before, not that they're, you know, I'm going to take a vacation there next year, but certainly comparatively, you know, it's much better. So that'd be the first thing. The second, don't underestimate dollars and I wrote down end strength. That's how military people measure a size of force. In 1992, after the first Gulf War, the Army had to reduce its size by 1/3 and its budget by 30%. That was a significant emotional event in the life of the Army and forced us to rethink many, many things in the way we'd done business, and ultimately ended up in us adopting the whole information sphere and digitization and computer-centric command and control, and added all that stuff to our weaponry as part of ways to increase our combat effectiveness while we decrease size and money. So crises, whether they're losing a war or losing your money or losing your priest, crises are opportunities if you recognize the crisis. And the second part is correct identification of the problems in the crisis. Identify the problem, understand the problem, describe the problem from as many different standpoints as you can, and then last, own the problem. Don't kind of push it away. Well, we don't really have a problem. It's the society, or you know, what we did when we changed to the volunteer army. We can't get enough volunteers because American people aren't patriotic enough. No, that wasn't the issue at all. We had a problem. We had to solve it. So, identifying a problem, describing it, understanding it, and taking ownership of it is I would say, equally important as taking opportunities that arise out of crises.
Jim, so good to see you. Mike Montalongo with Sodexo and also with the National Review Board. I want to go back for a second and pick up on the thought that the gentleman was making about time management and capacity management. What you've laid out in terms of enlightened leadership model, I think, is a very good one. But I was wondering, since you had brought that particular issue up of capacity management, I wonder, structurally speaking, at least for parishes, or dioceses probably more appropriately, if using a deputy, you know, a COO in the corporate world can perhaps help with that. So as an example, and this was probably after you and I had left the Pentagon, one of the points that were made about the management of the Pentagon, if you will, the Defense Secretary, was to have a full-time CMO, call it Chief Management Officer, because there was so much on the Secretary's plate to be able to handle the policy issues plus the management and leadership of the department. So I wonder if you can comment, structurally speaking, in terms of dioceses and parishes, if maybe something like that can perhaps
Thanks, Mike.
be appropriate.
That's really good. The higher you start as an Army officer, you start at captain, you command 150 people. That's the first time you have even a limited capacity as a staff. As a battalion commander, 450, you get a smaller staff, about 39. Then it keeps growing as you go up the rank. But in each one of these, there's a choice that the commander has to make, and I'll go back to the pastor has to make, or the religious leader has to make, or the bishop has to make. What's my role as a leader? And what's my role as a manager? They're related. They're both inherent to me. They can't be separated. But what do I do? And just again from how I answered it, on the management side, I divested the day-to-day management to my executive officer or my deputy commander or my COO, whatever you wanted it. But I didn't divest it like an arrow. You know, you shoot it, fire and forget, and it's gone. You can't. It's what rhythm do I have to establish with my executive officer, deputy, COO, so that I meet with that person and his or her key subordinates at a certain period so that the staff feels that they have sufficient claim on my time with the right frequency, that they can then use their initiative within their intent between those periods. And in between those periods, don't come to bother me. That's why God gave me a deputy or a COO or executive officer. Go bother that person so that I could be liberated to do the leadership stuff, the counseling stuff, the performance, the observation, the visiting the battlefield on the leadership side. So there is a structural part to leadership, just like there's a time management aspect of leadership. And the size and complexity of the structure should be mirrored by the scope of the job. So you would expect that a religious community, a global religious community, would have a different structure than a local parish. So I think that's what you were getting at. Yeah.
First of all, General, thank you for all of your service to the country and to our church. You mentioned briefly with Father's question about owning the problem. You know, I always find with collaboration, one of the biggest issues is accountability. And so I do a lot of work in community organizing. If somebody tells me they're going to turn 25 people out to an event, I expect them to turn 25 people out to the event. But a lot of times that turns people off then when you hold them accountable, or people hold me accountable. And I find that that really destroys a lot of organizations, especially when you're accounting on volunteers. Yeah. So how do you get around that of holding each other accountable?
I'm glad you mentioned a volunteer, because I mean, it is different. You know, for me as a military commander, holding someone accountability is, you know, I had the laws. I was also the commander and had the court authority, non-judicial punishment authority. So you don't rely on that very often, but it's always in the background. And the higher you go, the less often you do stuff like that. The more it's convincing, the more it's persuasion, the more it's inclusion. But I watched my wife, who was a senior executive, retired senior executive from another government agency, and so she's got a lot of leadership experience. She had the hardest time leading volunteers after she retired and worked on post. But she ultimately figured it out. And she didn't divest responsibility and accountability just because you were a volunteer. She had to develop other skills, other motivational skills, other alternatives, having two people do a thing rather than one, because today my baby might be sick, and so, you know, the volunteer's off, the job still has to be done. More follow-ups than she did on her when she was on active duty. So all this stuff has to be learned on the job, but there are some basics of leadership and one of them is accountability. And, you know, just because you're leading volunteers. I mean, I volunteered for every Thursday to pick up bread for our parish and distribution to several charities. I mean, I don't take it as an option that I'm there on Thursday, and neither does the guy in charge. He kind of checks up on us. But he has backups and backups to backups, where, you know, you don't have to do that. So, I mean, it's not an easy thing, and I can't really give you a silver bullet on that one. Not that I have any silver bullets. Ma'am.
Thank you also. I'm wondering if you have any examples or have some suggestions about how you convert people to becoming more collaborative, to moving from the type 1 leadership to the type 2. Because I think that's what we would like to do, is to develop more leaders and to develop opportunities for collaboration. Thank you.
Well, The first and most important way is to example it yourself. You can't ask your subordinates to be collaborative and you're authoritative. It just doesn't work out that way. They'll mirror your behavior. And the second is to teach how to collaborate. The role of the leader, whether a commander or not commander, is also the role of the teacher. You can't expect people to do things that they don't know how to do. So, you know, I could not walk up in front of all my battalion commanders, let's say when I was a division commander, the 14 battalion commanders, all of you will collaborate and you'll start at 9 o'clock tomorrow. See you later. And expect that there's going to be any collaboration. They're going to do exactly what they have done the day before. But what I can do is conduct a series of professional development classes myself and teach how battalion commanders should use collaboration in the running of their battalions. I did that, and the same thing at Brigade Command and Corps Command. I ended up having to do that in Iraq because the 13 subordinate generals I had were from 7 different nations. So even if I would say, all you guys go out tomorrow to collaborate, and they all said, yes, we will, there were 7 different interpretations of collaboration if I was going to be lucky. So, you know, there's a component of teaching to this, and a time investment in teaching. So the only 2 things that I can say that work for me. Paul. Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. I'll get you next.
Paul Butler, work with the roundtable here. Can you talk about self-awareness? If you're a type 1, type 2 leader, sometimes there's some blind spots. How do people talk to you as a general?
Any people have blind spots. You can
you.
be a type 1, 2, 3, 4, any kind of leader, and you have blind spots. Again, this for me, it comes down to humility and picking people who aren't afraid to tell you that. I was very lucky to be served in every job with people like that. Now, you know, partially I created the conditions for that by hiring them and not shooting them when they came in and told me something I didn't want to hear. Now, sometimes, you know, I'm picturing one woman that worked for me, great Air Force officer, and she would just come in and say to me, sir, do not shoot me after I deliver this message. And that would put me in the right mode to listen to what she had to say. She was always very astute and very often exactly on target. But it's a senior's responsibility to set that climate. You cannot expect a junior. You'll find some junior and subordinate leaders who, of their own power of their own will and personality, will do this. They are the minority. It's the senior that has to say to them, as I've heard many of my seniors say to me, do not walk away from a meeting if you think I just said something, I directed something incredibly stupid, and you walk away, you have failed in your duty. And that, for me, that was drilled into my head as a very junior officer. It's the senior's responsibility to do that. The other thing I had in Baghdad that worked for me really well is a Medicus golf club. I don't know if you guys seen, you know, the Medicus golf club is this golf club that looks like a golf club, but has a hinge on it. And so if you have any tension in your hand, the head goes limp. And you have any tension in your shoulders or your arms or your hands, you swing the club and it breaks. Well, I had one of those in Baghdad. And many times I said, I need a break, I need to go swing the club, which means I need to get the tension out. Or someone would come in with the club and say, sir, you're going to need this when you're done with this briefing. So it's just having little tricks, you know, like that give opportunities to subordinates to. But you got to have them because we all have blind spots. And luckily, I'm married to a person who is great at identifying blind spots and has no fear whatsoever of identifying them. But you know.
First of all, sir, lead the way, sir, and
all the way.
Just a quick question in terms of the title here for Managing from Mission. I recall pre-deploy having to recite the Soldier's Creed every morning and always placing the mission first. Part of the problem that I see is that we have leaders that at this point are dealing with so many missions. Any strategies, sir, in regard to trying to come up with a common mission and being able to place that mission first.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. All of us face that challenge of prioritization. And as a leader, if you're unwilling to make priority decisions, then your organization is going to look more like a diffracted light than a focused light. You're not going to have laser focus if you don't set priorities. And that was part of the question I had here before about making the paradigm shift in Baghdad. We had to get a laser focus on 3 important issues, and everything else, if it didn't happen, then I'll take the blame for it. But we had to get these 3 things done. There's no organization that I've ever been associated with that has ever said to itself, we don't have enough to do. I wish there would be some more stuff. And I've never worked with a leader that walked around the organization because he or she had nothing to do. All of our organizations are busy, and so it's inherent in the leadership responsibility to set the direction of the organization, set the priorities, set the vision, motivate people, and then have a management structure to keep the organization on that track. That's why I separate in one sense leadership from management, but I can't separate the execution. Leaders set direction, set vision, motivate and inspire followers, and then set up a management structure that keeps the organization on track. Otherwise, the organization will go the way it wants to go, because all human beings know that they don't need leaders, that they're completely happy to. They know more than anybody else, and you want to be in an organization like that because you got pretty powerful people in it. So, man.
Joan Neal. And just to follow up on your last point, Jim, it seems to me that there are differences between the habits of leadership and those and the skills of managers, or maybe the habits of managers. At some point those skills have to come together. But I'm wondering if there's more that the roundtable can do, if there's more that we as leaders in the organizations that we are in can do to help others, to help ourselves and to help others to recognize the habits of leadership, to begin to develop and work on those habits and put them into practice, as well as I think we're doing a very good job of helping people recognize the skills of management and to acquire those skills and to use them effectively. But I'm wondering about the other piece of that, the leadership habits.
Well, thanks. I can't reinvent work that's already so well developed and well presented. All the Stephen Covey books are, how can you be a leader without having been introduced to them? The Peter Senge books, the Tom Peters books, some of my favorite ones are written by Ron Heifetz, Leadership Without Easy Answers, Leadership on the Line, Adaptive Leadership. So the literature's out there. It's a matter of translating what's out there to your specific case, and all of us have that responsibility. I certainly have nothing more to add than those 4 authors that I listed, and a host of others that have written about this. I go back to Socrates. It's the gap between knowing and doing. Okay, we know it. It's doing it that's hard. And all of us that are lucky enough to be leaders have that as a responsibility to do it, not to make excuses why we can't. We're too busy, I don't have enough time, and my people aren't really good, my boss hasn't set any priorities, those are off. Ho-hum, give me a leader here. Yeah. I got 2 on that one.
Yeah, justify. Except an issue with your last comment is that sometimes the boss doesn't have an appreciation
Absolutely.
for the difference.
Absolutely.
And so what happens when the expectations of the boss are manage this function well, get it done, get those things done that need to get done.
Yeah.
But you know that in order to be effective in doing that, you have to practice some of these leadership skills. You have to step back, assess the situation, et cetera.
So I'll give you an example.
So your performance review is based
I've got this image. My colonel, when I was a major, said to me one time, and it's going to hit every one of your items here. Now, I'm in this position that's called a key developmental position. Screw this up, you don't get promoted. So that's how you. So I'm in this job, and my boss is unhappy with me because I have suggested things out of my to him. And he's 2 levels up above me, and he says to me, "Stop thinking. I don't want you to think anymore. You're done thinking. I've done all the thinking. You just do what the heck I tell you to do, and everything will be happy." And of course, I said yes, sir, and then ignored him and did what I knew had to be done. My performance review was below average for both years, and I lucked out and got promoted. Look, this is another excuse. Are you going to, do you want people in your organization who only want to get a good performance review? And that's why, now, all of us have them. I'm not saying that, the Army is clean. We are not, these hands dirty. But it comes time we got to look in the mirror and say, what kind of person am I? Am I going to buckle under the Colonel so-and-so and do what he says and ruin the organization? Or as Socrates would have said had he been thinking about this, this is the right thing to do, pass the hemlock. All of us are in positions like that sooner or later. And if you're afraid of the hemlock, don't sit in a seat.
Betty Ann Donnelly, do you have any learnings from your career in the military that might be helpful to us in the church for helping to integrate women into the leadership of the church?
Of course, we did that. 1976, we first admitted women to West Point, and the world was going to end. The sky was going to fall down. There was no way we could possibly figure out how to have women go to the field with us at the same together, and it was not possible. It was just, this was stupid. Communists obviously have infiltrated the political leadership, and the country was going to fall. Well, guess what? None of that stuff happened. And then it was, well, women are going to be pilots. They're going to fly, I'm talking Army stuff. They're going to fly attack helicopters. Oh, this is going to be terrible. They're never going to be able to think fast enough. They're not going to be able to, they're not strong enough. And guess what? None of that stuff happened. Now it's, well, we're going to have women in infantry, armor, field artillery units starting next year in selected positions. Oh, this is going to be impossible. It's the whole morale's going to fall. None of that's going to happen either. My conclusion, I've watched this for 37 years in the Army, is men, get over it. Half of the world's population can contribute if you don't get in their way. It's just that. Now that's you asked about the Army, and it's my answer to the Army.
Jim, thank you so very, very much. Please join me in thanking Jim Dubik. General Dubik is clearly talking about the Army, but the parallels to the challenges for the church are palpable. I hope you can tell that with such a leader at the helm on the board of the Leadership Roundtable on Church Management, we are very well served. Whether it is talking about strategy or tactics or vision or cultivating a disposition of humility, General Dubik really serves the roundtable and by extension the church remarkably. There was just that one time at a board meeting when he got his poncho out and a flashlight that I thought we might be in trouble. So this concludes the afternoon. In half an hour we will celebrate the Eucharist. We have Bishop Friend as our presider. And proclaiming the gospel, we have Deacon John Kerrigan, who was ordained to the diaconate just last month. And we're very happy to have him here. He is He is also an esteemed site leader at Stanford, but his background is in investments, so you've got the trifecta there. If you need assistance getting to Dahlgren Chapel, which is across campus, it is walkable and staff will be directing you. But if you need special assistance, please see me or one of my colleagues, and we can use the golf cart to transport you. And then after the liturgy, we will come back to this part of campus, to the building next door, the Levy Center, and the cocktail reception will take place in the faculty room.